areas. So yeah, I think that's been one of the big things about the carbon farm planning process is thinking about it in terms of like, an area that you would probably just kind of let do its thing and, mow it every now and then or whatever, that there actually is a lot of potential there to increase biodiversity and, you know, stack functions like having some of those species function as windbreaks as well.
In this episode of Voices from the Field, we dig into Texas's first carbon farm plan with New Leaf Agriculture Farm Director Matt Simon, NCAT Climate and Agriculture Program Manager Elise Haschke, and NCAT Sustainable Agriculture Specialist Darron Gaus. Matt shares with us his aha moments in farming and his vision for ecological restoration and community building on New Leaf's 21-acre farm. Carbon farm planning is a comprehensive conservation planning network that centers carbon as the organizing principle on working lands. With generous funding from a Southern Sustainable Agriculture Resource and Education Professional Development Program grant and the Meadows Foundation, NCAT is working with Texas farmers and ranchers to pilot the carbon farm planning conservation framework for a Texas context. Darron and Matt discuss specific conservation practices in the New Leaf's carbon farm plan, such as how he's testing no-till and strip-till in a few of the fields and planting windbreaks for multiple co-benefits, including fruit and nut cash crops, on-farm mulch production and wildlife habitat. Those practices indicate an estimated annual emissions reduction of 22 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. If you're a farmer or rancher in Texas who is interested in developing a whole farm conservation plan centered around opportunities to capture and store more carbon on your farm, we'd love to hear from you. The notes of this podcast contains email addresses for Elise and Darron if you want to learn more about what's going on in Texas. Let's listen.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Voices from the Field. I'm NCAT Climate and Agriculture Program Manager Elise Haschke, based in Central Texas. In today's podcast, we'll be digging into Texas's first carbon farm plan with Matt Simon, Farm Director at New Leaf Agriculture, a 21-acre farm situated in the Texas Blackland Prairie, just 30 minutes east of Austin. We're also joined by my colleague, Darron Gaus, NCAT Sustainable Ag Specialist, who has been instrumental in our planning team and brings a wealth of expertise and technical assistance. Thanks so much, y'all, for being here today.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Elise.
Yeah. So we're going to dig into all sorts of creative ways to think about farming in a way that really takes to heart the One Health principle that Dr. Ratan Lal elevated in our recent Growing Hope conference. The idea that health of soil, plants, animals, humans, the environment, and the planetary processes is one and indivisible. If you missed any of those sessions, you can catch the recordings on our ATRA YouTube page. So Matt, we're going to jump right in. You and I met. You and I met about, I think 8 or 9 years ago in the fields of Green Gate Farms. I think at that time you were a farm manager. Is that correct?
Geez, 8 or 9 years ago, I was probably still just volunteering, I think.
Yeah.
It all kind of blurs together. But yeah, I think at that point I was probably still a work share. So coming out really regularly to the farm to work 4 hours per week and go home with a CSA share. And I did that for many years out there. Yeah.
Yeah. You caught the bug. I think that's
Mm-hmm.
where a lot of us in the Central Texas community caught the bug. Green Gate had a great work share program. I remember we were probably tangled up in a jungle of tomato vines, probably harvesting tomatoes one summer. So I know a lot about you. I don't know everything, but I know you to be incredibly dedicated to the agroecological principles of farming. And I also know that you accomplished a great deal between now and then. So I'd love for our listeners to get to know you, and we can just start things off by hearing about your farming background and your farming philosophy.
Sure. Yeah, so like you mentioned, I think I first got into working on farms as a work share out at Green Gate Farms, and I want to say that was maybe in 2012. And what drew me to it was just a love for working outside. I'd always had various manual labor jobs. I think at the time I was working for a recycling startup in Austin that was doing Austin's first single stream recycling for businesses. So just really enjoyed being outdoors and, kind of working out in the fresh air and using my hands to get the job done. So yeah, started volunteering at Greengate and met Skip Connett and Aaron Flynn, who would become my farming mentors, my first farming mentors, and worked out there for probably 5 years as a work share. And around 2015, I started as part of my volunteering, I was working with Multicultural Refugee Coalition, who I work with now out here at New Leaf. And at that point, I was still a volunteer, but I was helping to run what they called their Farm Link program. And so essentially, it was a way for refugees to be able to go out to a farm once a week and keep their hands in the dirt and stay connected to that agricultural background that they brought with them from their countries of origin. So I would pick people up and take them out to the farm, and we would all work together, and they would take home a bunch of veggies, and it was always a really cool experience seeing the way folks from different cultures, as soon as we would get out to the farm, it was almost like there was another language that farming brought out, and everyone was really, really great at working as a team, even if they were from, some folks from Bhutan, some folks from Congo, different places. So yeah, through working and volunteering at Greengate was kind of my introduction to working in refugee ag as well. And so also right around 2015, I got my permaculture design certificate from the Austin Permaculture Guild. And I think that process was probably what sparked me to consider a career in agriculture. I'd always been interested in it and interested in eating good food. And I don't think I had quite considered how much agriculture can help to restore ecosystems until I took that permaculture design course, and it was a 2-week intensive, and everyone camped at the place where we were learning, and it was just a really kind of transformational experience. And yeah, I think through that I found out about Mark Shepard's farm. He wrote a book called Restoration Agriculture, and he's up in Viola, Wisconsin. And that was really the first time I had been exposed to kind of how a farm with annuals and perennials and livestock and just a really diverse ecosystem can produce just tons of different food throughout the year, and then also have a really significant environmental impact, specifically around carbon as well. I hadn't really made that connection that if your farming ecosystem is functioning as sort of robustly as it can, that it can actually be quite a tool for helping to combat climate change and sequester carbon and those sorts of things. So I think that was really an aha moment for me, was that permaculture design course, and sort of realizing the impact that one could have through ecological farming. And so, I think at the time I was playing in bands and touring around and volunteering at Greengate when I could as well. And then in 2017 was when my band kind of stopped touring as seriously, and Skip and Aaron over at Greengate were looking for some managerial help. And even though I hadn't really worked for them in the past, I had been out there now for 5 years every week, and was really close with them and the family, and knew the farm pretty intimately. So Skip thankfully gave me a chance and was like, okay, here we go. I don't know if you quite know what you're getting into, but yeah. So he brought me on summer of 2017, and I lived out at the farm for a few years and just really fully immersed myself in organic farming out there. And then around the same time, MRC also through Skip actually met our current landowner, John Beal, out here at New Leaf. And So right around the same time, New Leaf got established as well. And so I was sort of beginning my farming journey, although not working with MRC at the time, but was beginning my farming journey kind of at the same time that New Leaf was getting established.
That's really great. It sounds like you did a great kind of stepwise progression of learning the principles, learning about permaculture, really understanding the reason why, and then getting to apply it on a farm and learning the business of farming. And I know that Green Gate had so many diversified markets as well. I mean, it was a very active farm business to be managing. So you really kind of got to learn through that.
Yeah,
That side
absolutely.
of things. Yeah. So now you're at New Leaf. You've been at New Leaf for how long has it been? 3 years?
3 years, yeah.
3
So
years.
started in 2020. So yeah, going
Mhm.
into my fourth year here.
Okay. So tell us a little bit more about the background of New Leaf. You've mentioned the Multicultural Refugee Coalition.
Mhm.
And so what is the connection between New Leaf and MRC? And what are some of the goals you have for New Leaf Farm as part of a larger nonprofit organization?
Yeah, so Multicultural Refugee Coalition, which I'll abbreviate to MRC
Yeah,
just because
it
it's
makes it
a bit of
easier.
a tongue twister. But yeah, MRC started out as a really a community organization, and they had community gardens around Austin, different high schools and various parks and things like that. And then they also had a community sewing studio. And so through those two programs, they just kept hearing from the folks who were involved there, like, oh, if I just had some land of my own, or if I just had a place to sew, then, I could use these skills that I've brought from my home country and, could really apply those here to provide for my family. And that was really the need that both the farm, New Leaf Agriculture, and then also Open Arms Studio, which is our textile studio, that was really the need that those two enterprises were addressing, was that idea that, like, oh, there's these really valuable skills and we just need a place to apply them. And so that was really the impetus for seeking out farmland. And Skip Conant over at Green Gate introduced Wandaka, who was kind of I think of him as the founder of New Leaf, but he was a really enthusiastic Congolese young man who helped to start New Leaf and kind of make that connection with John Beal, our landowner. And so in 2017, we got out here and kind of started getting things rolling. And spring of 2018 was the first growing season. And yeah, it's been really interesting working with John. He's been a long time conservationist in the area, and he started the Wilbarger Creek Conservation. I always mess up the name. I think Wilbarger Creek Conservation
Conservancy?
Alliance or Conservancy. It's one of the two. We'll have to figure that out and put it in the show notes.
You'll
But
look that up, yeah.
yeah, but anyway, he's rallied several of the landowners in the area. So there's actually 2,000 contiguous acres, right outside Austin, that are in conservation easements. And it's been a really awesome thing to see how much organic regenerative farming really aligns with conservationists priorities, and how much we both really value stewarding the land. And I really think that as it becomes harder and harder for younger farmers to purchase land and have the money to build up the infrastructure and all everything it takes to get a farm off the ground, I really feel like that partnership between conservation organizations and organic farmers is going to be pretty essential going forward in order to have like a thriving organic farming community.
I definitely agree. I mean, it's the Wilbarger Creek Conservation Alliance, and those alliances
Ah,
are so
yeah.
key. I mean, just being out on the farm, a week and a half ago, y'all have a partnership with Tree Folks, who's also been working with John Beal to restore some riparian buffers along the creeks and the watersheds.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it takes a village. It really does, to restore these dynamic ecosystems.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, which way do you want to take it? Should we
Where do we
talk more
go
about
from
New
here?
Leaf or?
Yeah, I'd love to talk more about New Leaf. So tell us what you're growing. Tell us a little bit about the operation. I know you have some farm goals, but I'd love to just kind of paint the picture of the farm for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, it's 21 acres that we have leased here. And I would say about 6 of that are croppable for annual vegetables, and the rest are wooded areas or areas that are more amenable to orchard production or those sorts of things. So it's about 6 acres of organic annual vegetables. We're certified organic. That was something that I was originally brought on, was to help get that organic certification because I had learned about that process at Greengate. So no chemical inputs of any kind, synthetic fertilizers, anything like that. And we do mixed produce. We probably grow about 60 or 70 different varieties throughout the year. And the main way that we distribute our produce is through a CSA. I'm sure a lot of listeners are familiar with that model, but it's essentially like a veggie subscription box. So it's 7 to 9 items each week that go into the bag. And we also sell at the Mueller Farmers Market in Austin. And we actually also have 150 laying hens that we rotate through the field. And when we get talking about the carbon farm plan a little bit more, we can talk about how we work them into the rotation. So we do eggs as well, also certified organic. And one area that we've been getting a lot more into this past year is refugee food access. Prior to this past fall, we were real similar to other organic farms with a CSA. We just happen to employ refugees, which is awesome, and it's been a really cool mission to help connect folks to those livelihood opportunities. But I think both from hearing from our CSA members and just looking at what other refugee ag organizations have done, I think we really had a goal to get more of our produce into refugee households.
Mhm.
And so we've really kind of shifted our efforts in that direction, now that the farm is up and running after a few seasons. And so yeah, we got a City of Austin food justice mini grant probably about a year and a half ago, and that allowed us to pilot a partnership with Refugee Services of Texas, where we would deliver our CSA shares to them, and then they would distribute those along with their other food distributions. So we got an opportunity to pilot that, and then that went really well. And then through a grant with Travis County this past year, we've been able to ramp up that CSA distribution so that now we're distributing 75 CSA shares per week into refugee households. And
That's amazing.
through, yeah, it's been
That's
really
amazing, Matt.
incredible hearing the feedback from the families getting the produce, and just
Yeah.
how grateful they are to have that as an addition to their first months here in the States. I think
Yeah.
it's really heartwarming to hear about Afghan families having the opportunity to cook a lot of the same vegetables that they had at home, and a really nice kind of welcome package for them.
Absolutely.
So yeah, so that's one way that we've been getting into the food access arena. And then also we have what's called our traditional provisions program. And this is essentially like a production scale community garden bed. So each of our community farmers is what we call them. They get 5 50-foot production scale beds. And this has been a great way to expand our employment opportunities to more folks out here who can earn some supplemental income. A lot of people have familial responsibilities. A lot of people are living in multi-generational households and either have little ones to take care of or older folks and those sorts of things. So they can't commit to actually working out at the farm, 4 or 5 days a week, but they can come out to their community beds and they get to choose what they want to grow for their own communities. And we provide everything they need from the seeds to the fertilizer. We also have a training certificate program just teaching them about production scale methods. And then we purchase the produce from them and help them to distribute it to their own communities. And so this spring, we're ramping up to have 18 community beds, and all of that produce is going for free into the refugee community. And it's been, again, just really heartwarming to kind of see that impact expand to more people.
Absolutely. Now y'all are doing so many things. I feel like every time that we talk, I hear something new. I hear something new that maybe isn't new that you've been doing, but it's new I'm learning about.
Yeah, no, it definitely feels that way. Definitely in the past year, there's just been so much momentum and a lot of great directions. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of momentum, and you're really riding that wave. So now I'm even more interested. I was gonna ask what drew you to conservation planning, but I'm even wondering, like, with all the things you have on your plate, it really must take a commitment to want to conservation plan, to actually pursue something as detailed as what we are pursuing through a carbon farm plan. Can you share a little bit more about what drew you to this framework and this very detailed way of looking at the landscape and, assessing all opportunities for not just capturing carbon, but, like you said, really restoring ecological function on the farm? It's a very thorough process. What about it's appealing to you? Why did you come to us?
Yeah, I mean, like I mentioned in my PDC, I kind of learned what's possible. And, I've heard a lot of older farmers who have transitioned from, especially like chemical intensive row cropping to more regenerative practices say that, they were never really drawn to regenerative agriculture because of the climate impact or anything like that. I think they just got to a point where what they had been doing for so long wasn't working anymore. Whereas I think a lot of folks in my generation are actually directly drawn to things like the carbon farm planning process, because that's a big part of what got us into agriculture in the first place, is the idea that, we could have that environmental and ecological impact. And yeah, I mean, I think, the long I've been farming for 5 years now, going on 6, and I just find the longer that you do it, the more you start to recognize the connections, kind of the infinite connections between, soil health, plant health, pests, water, water conservation, disease, all of those things. You just really, every season and really just every day is a learning experience, kind of seeing how all those things fit together. So the idea of having a planning process where you're being very methodical about the way that all these things are fitting together and kind of designing your crop plan and your various systems around, this framework of carbon sequestration, which ultimately just leads to better yields and better, disease and pest resistance. I think it was kind of like the missing piece in my kind of overall framework about how I think about the farm. I think you get so caught up in kind of what's next, like, oh, we gotta get out there and till this bed up because we have this that needs to go in a couple weeks, and you gotta, you get kind of stuck in, especially this time of year, kind of stuck in that kind of reactive mode, where you're just kind of like trying to make sure that you're keeping the train on the rails. But the idea of having this framework where, you're thinking 6 months to a year ahead in terms of your rotation and what's going to be best for soil health, it takes a lot more planning, and it is a lot more work in a certain sense, but it also is kind of relaxing because it feels like, oh, okay, I have confidence now that all the decisions I'm making are like working toward this sort of more robust form of farming, if that makes sense.
NCAT's Growing Hope Conference is sponsored in part by Rural South Institute, a nonprofit organization honored to be part of the efforts by the U.S. Department of Agriculture to assist military veterans reintegrating into civilian society as they retire or return from active duty abroad. Through grant funding from USDA's National Institute of Food and Agriculture, RSI offers mentoring services, training, education, outreach, and technical assistance to veterans and their families in Alabama. RSI was conceived in 2018 and born out of the need and desire to assist underprivileged youth and economically depressed communities. The Institute is dedicated to protecting the environment, guiding and educating youth, and cultivating the next generation of minority farmers and rural entrepreneurs. For more information, visit the Rural South Institute's website at ruralsouthinstitute.com.
That totally makes sense. It gives you a longer term kind of vision that you can fall back on instead of just, plowing ahead day to day. What's right in front of you? What fire needs to be put out? What do you need to address today and tomorrow? Yeah. It does kind of give a roadmap for that. And I remember in our, we also recently presented at the Texas Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association. And you were also speaking from the farmer's perspective of the value of having a plan that really offers integrity to what you say you are committed to doing on the farm. And the plan can really back that up.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of, with the best of intentions, a lot of farmers really tout their sort of, environmental ethos and impact and those sorts of things. And I think that, that's great. And I think it's been awesome to see the public get more educated on just how different like an organic, sort of ecological farming method is than typical chemical agriculture. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I think I speak about the farm a fair amount, at fundraisers and, various little engagements and things like that. And I would always kind of have this idea in the back of my head whenever I was talking about our positive environmental and like climate impact and all these things. I was kind of like, I can say that with a certain amount of confidence, but I really would like to actually be able to point to specific practices and point to, our overall vision of where the farm is headed and actually be able to quantify some of that and be able to explain in very like tangible terms like why certain practices are important, rather than just be like, oh yeah, we're an organic farm, so of course we're sustainable or whatever. It's like, yeah. I think that it's such a big topic, and it's one that I think people need a lot more education around, like just how much of a positive impact this kind of farming can have. And so I think the more that we kind of quantify that and can hold up these plans as saying like, here is like an actual tangible thing that you can really sink your teeth into about where your food is coming from, I think that's just going to empower farmers a lot more to tell their story, and also empower consumers to feel that whatever food choices they're making really are the best decisions for their local ecosystem. So yeah, I think that's really what that concept of integrity is kind of really what drew me to wanting to put the work into transitioning the way we do a lot of stuff out here.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, it's fully transparent. It's full transparency of what you're doing.
And I will say, with the whole idea that that a lot of times farming can be kind of reactive and all of that, and you can be sort of very busy and kind of lose sight of the bigger picture. I will say that it's been just awesome working with you and Darron, and I think that I can confidently say I probably would not have written a carbon farm plan on my own. So the fact that NCAT has been so supportive of this and, really using our plan as a jumping off point for what I hope are tons and tons of carbon farm plans coming down the pipe in the coming years. Yeah, I just feel really grateful that resource is here.
Well, thank you, Matt. We feel likewise.
Thank you.
Yeah. Very grateful to be working with you. I mean, you're really kind of you're a leader in Texas. You're pioneering this. We're all pioneering this. We're piloting it, and your dedication and your passion and your knowledge are a great mix that has been a real pleasure to work with. So
yeah, thank you.
Feelings mutual, and I think that's a great opportunity for us to dive in. Let's loop in Darron to this conversation. Darron has had a lot of on-farm experience as well. So I wanted to give you, Darron, a chance to talk more about some of those tangible elements of a carbon farm plan that Matt was alluding to. And, I'll start off by saying that we've now had a chance to walk the farm multiple times and really like put our hands in the soil and understand the different systems, understand the contours, understand Matt's vision for where the farm could go. combining it with consultation that we've done with Carbon Cycle Institute. So Darron, I'd love for you to have a chance to kind of tee us up with carbon farm planning on New Leaf and just what that process has been, how it's taking shape on the farm, kind of how we're looking at things on the farm.
Okay. Matt, I applaud you for what you do, and I really have been enjoying working with you ever since the first visit. We kind of have a similarly different background where, we enjoy the outdoors and we want to be in it more, and then we kind of both worked for nonprofits with a mission and get to grow vegetables and food for people that need it the most. And so I've really enjoyed working with you, and I've kind of been in your shoes. And so when we entered this process of looking at your farm through a carbon lens, I remember being in the front of your fields and you already mentioning having a pollinator strip outside that fence line along the road. I knew then that you understood that it wasn't just, the vegetable plots. It wasn't just the things that you were growing cash crops out of that mattered on your farm. And so it's been a real exciting adventure to kind of help you kind of continue painting your canvas there at the farm. And that's, I guess I'll let you talk about especially those vegetable plot areas. You already had a NRCS conservation plan that you were working with the NRCS conservation agent in your county. Do you want to talk about that a little bit first?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think learning from the organic farmers that I've learned from in the past, like I've always sort of understood the importance of, crop rotation and cover cropping and those sorts of things, and sort of seen firsthand the benefits. And when you skip steps, kind of the impact of that as well. And so, yeah, I think that in the carbon farm plan, the way that I feel like we've been approaching the annual production in particular has been just like, what does that rotation look like? Like, what is the ideal sort of sequence going from cover crop to cash crop to, in our case, the 150 chickens that we have. And when I think about the sort of the transition from, or kind of the distinction between organic farming and regenerative farming, because that's another word that kind of gets thrown around a lot and it's becoming more defined. But I think, when I think about just the few features that make that distinction, it would probably be, on a regenerative farm, there's animals involved in the crop rotation. And then I would say, there's perennials in the ecosystem as well, whether that be like perennial cover crops or pollinator strips or, trees, those sorts of things. And then, I would also say the other one would be reduced tillage, because a lot of organic farms, ours included, up until we're really trying to change a lot of things. I mean, that is essentially your weed control method, is, tilling and tilling and tilling again, just until, you get as clean a bed as possible. And, I think that was another thing that really drew me to the carbon farm plan, was to actually look at practical ways to reduce tillage and really try to dial in, what's possible within a given rotation, moving toward reduced tillage and, potentially even no tillage, which we'll be practicing a little bit this spring, kind of piloting a couple different approaches to that. So yeah, I feel like in my mind, the approach that we're taking to all of the annual cropping is sort of still keeping a lot of the cover cropping as well as the crop rotation that we've done in the past, but we're getting animals in the mix or reducing tillage, and just really trying to maximize every niche that we have to improve the soil health throughout the growing season and in the shoulder seasons. And yeah, it's been really interesting to kind of look at all those opportunities and how to best fill them.
And we really got to grow off of that conservation plan. There's over 200 practices that NRCS of these conservation practices. And so we got to kind of look at what you were implementing with that NRCS plan, and then also just look at all the other places on your farm through that carbon lens. And you were talking about specifically on the no-till and the reduced-till practices. Do you want to talk a little bit more about what we talked about and what you're going to try, the two different ways of trying to reduce your tillage and then also trying to do that strip tillage area?
Yeah, yeah. So, there's a couple spots on the farm that have been notoriously difficult to grow things, and but at the same time, we've been using other areas of the farm that have been more amenable for growing our cash crops kind of season over season, and you can really tell that those areas are starting to get a little spent. So one of the areas that we're going to be implementing a more no-till approach in is one of those fields that hasn't done so great in the past. And so sort of our approach to that, starting this past fall, we did a good cover crop of some oats and some peas, some 4010 field peas. So a good winter cover crop. And then we have been running the chickens on that. We left them on there for about a month in two 50 by 100-foot sections. And then we recently took the chickens off of there. And then we're going to be mowing that here in the next week or so, mowing it really low. And then we've brought in enough compost to where we're essentially going to be able to cover, I don't know if we're going to do the whole field necessarily, but to cover a good 30-inch bed width compost, and actually do like 6 inches of compost onto that. And so and then plant directly into the compost. And we're planning on doing all of our winter squash up in that field. We usually do a summer winter squash crop, so we'll be doing butternut, acorn, a couple different kabochas and those sorts of things. So contrasted with how we used to do things, normally we would have potentially still had the chickens in there, but then as soon as they got off, we would have been disking that, probably would have disked it at a depth of about a foot to 18 inches, and done that 2 passes of that, potentially even 3, depending on what the weather did. If it kept raining and weeds kept coming, we would just keep sort of disking and disking. But part of what I'm excited to see is with the chickens in the mix, I think that from what I understand, it's a really good way to sort of make your soil kind of move in more of a fungal direction whenever you have sort of a more bacterial dominant soil. Chickens in particular and chicken manure are a good sort of switch to flip to move things in that more fungal direction. And then because we're not tilling it, we're going to leave those fungal networks intact and then essentially just build the bed on top of that. And over time, as I understand it, this is my first time employing this practice, but the compost will kind of seep down into the soil, and we'll end up with just a real uniform kind of well composted soil without actually tilling it in. So and I believe what you've called that practice, Darron, is planting flat. Is there anything else you think is worth adding about that?
No, no, I mean, not particularly. Like you said it well. You
Yeah.
described the whole process well, and that's what we're really trying to get at here at this carbon farm plan is opportunities like that. Opportunities that you were doing the best that you could, and it's better than most, but there's still potential for carbon loss. And so we're just not only trying to keep that carbon in the soil, but even potentially like with the adding of compost, we're bringing off farm carbon into your farm and adding it even more there. What about the strip till area? What are you going to try there?
Yeah, so I'm hoping to mow that today, actually. We've had a cover crop in there for, gosh, yeah, since October. And then it got kind of beaten back by a freeze and I reseeded a little bit. So it's been kind of chilling since then. We did peas and oats and a good amount of turnips, as well as daikon radish, purple top turnips and daikon radish. And we've left a lot of those in, actually. And so the idea is that those will help to aerate the soil as they decompose. And rather than tilling those in again, I'm going to be mowing that area And then we have just like a middle buster, like single shank subsoiler. And so we're going to be coming through with that. And on 5 foot bed spacings, we're going to be essentially just digging, a trench, like a 6 inch deep and 6 inch wide trench with that subsoiler, and then filling that with compost. And then that's going to be where we plant directly into that compost eggplant and tomatoes and peppers. That's going to kind of be our big summer nightshade area. And yeah, I'm really curious to see, how that practice takes shape. Obviously, I don't know if we'll always be able to buy in enough compost to put 6 inches of compost on the entire farm every year. So this could potentially be a little bit more of a cost effective approach. I'm also curious, we were talking a little while last week about looking at different no-till drills that have kind of a more narrow width, so potentially looking at like a 4 foot wide no-till drill. And I'm really curious to see if this kind of trench composting no-till approach, if in the future, we could potentially, after we've planted and before the plants are so big they're like spilling out into the alleys, but potentially get another cover crop in between those trenches and actually be able to essentially cover crop a field while you have a cash crop in it as well, to sort of feed those cash crops in the same season with a cover crop in between. Because typically we would be shaping our beds, and we might be packing them in closer than 5 feet if we feel like we're running out of space or something like that. So it'll be really interesting kind of having this more like flat working space that actually has vegetation in it. And I'm just assuming, we'll probably be approaching it where we're just trying to mow it whenever it gets up to maybe like shin height or something like that. But again, that mowing is going to be accomplished a lot easier because we don't have the beds raised like we usually do. So should just be like mowing the lawn in between the tomatoes.
Exactly right. And both
Yeah.
of those practices will also help you reduce, the amount of passes or labor that you would have to do in weed pressure, right? That would reduce your
Mhm.
weed pressure with both of those systems. And that's kind of just the co-benefit of that practice. And there's a lot of different practices that we looked at on your farm that have a co-benefits. And, like let's say like the wind barrier for one, not only is it going to reduce transpiration from your crop areas, but it also, we kind of talked about mental health, right? When you're working in the winter and you feel that northern wind just blowing your face all day, it kind of gets to you.
Mhm.
So, there's a lot of different co-benefits to having this giant woody species populated wind barrier that not only has a lot of above ground carbon, but will drastically increase below ground carbon as well in those areas growing off of that. Do you want to talk a little bit more about those areas, Matt?
Yeah, sure. So we have quite a bit of fence line out here on 20 acres. And so we're planning on doing both cash crops as well as more like, evergreen trees as well along certain barriers. And so that's going to kind of form the first line of defense against the wind. And yeah, I'm curious, as those windbreaks mature as well, potentially using them, pruning them and mulching them, and potentially working that mulch into the system as well. So even if we're not harvesting, pecans or mulberries or whatever it may be off of that windbreak, at least we'll be, kind of stacking functions again, like you said, and working those into the system. And then, we've also looked at various areas like along the berms and swales that are established out here. We're going to need to keep kind of a buffer aside from some of the orchard plantings that we have planned, in order to be able to pull the chicken coop back and forth along the swales back to the places where we're planting our annuals, to keep them rotating through the annual fields. And so, there's this 20-foot swath that we need to keep clear in order to take the chickens through it. But then the rest of the time of the year, what's going on there? And so one of the things that we talked about is more of an annual windbreak, which could have a lot of different potential species, or potentially even a perennial windbreak in those spots. I know that we were digging in a little bit to like different kinds of native grasses and different pollinator species and things like that that would suit that kind of, suit that niche really well. So yeah, I think that's been one of the big things about the carbon farm planning process is thinking about it in terms of like, an area that you would probably just kind of let do its thing and mow it every now and then or whatever, that there actually is a lot of potential there to increase biodiversity and stack functions like having some of those species function as windbreaks as well.
Yeah, and just like the conservation cover areas too, like you said, that bacterial dominated soil, we're going to be using these native perennials to kind of adjust that and make it a not only a more diverse above ground population, but a more diverse below ground population as well. And that'll all be those co-benefits. And what about the orchard areas? You want to describe what we're planning on doing in those orchard areas?
Yeah, so I mean, similar to trench composting in the annual fields that I was just mentioning, we actually this past week, I think Elise mentioned we have a partnership with a group called Tree Folks, and they brought a bunch of people out, a bunch of volunteers to plant peaches and figs and pecans and mulberries. So we already have the first orchard area of 3 or 4 already established, and we've left a good amount of space in between the trees. And similar to what we were talking about with the trench composting, we're planning on doing annual cover crops in between those orchard rows as well. One thing I didn't mention is we've been looking at ways to kind of combine the farm and textile enterprises. And we've been doing that through growing a lot of natural dye plants. We're experimenting with a few different ones. We've grown a lot of Mexican mint marigold in the past, which is a perennial that produces a yellow dye. And then this year we're doing some indigo as well as some madder, ladies' bed straw, a few different things in hopes that our textile studio can, use that for some of their products. But we've also been piloting long line fiber flax. So the past 2 years we've grown a little bit, and this year we're growing probably about 1/10 of an acre of flax for fiber. And so that was another thing that I had thought. It's about a 60-day crop depending on when you plant it. And so that was another thing that I had thought could function well in those orchard plantings, is potentially having that flax in there as a cover crop essentially, but then harvesting that and getting it processed for the fiber itself. So yeah, just really interested in kind of seeing what those orchard areas can do when we're thinking about more than just establishing the trees and keeping it mowed or whatever. So it's a lot more possibility there.
And you've worked with your community too. You talked about your neighbor who has a tree pruning company, and you're also going to be putting mulch underneath those orchard areas to help reduce the weed population and add more off-farm carbon to your farm as well. So what other resources like that have assisted you? What support resources have you used, like financially or technical assistance through this process?
Yeah, I mean, what we've really relied on is that community support. Tree Folks obviously were an awesome resource for the orchard planting, and we're planning on doing more with them in the fall. I think we're talking to a few different corporate sponsors who might want to bring their folks out to participate in that as well. And then, a lot of what we're doing in the plan is identified as, and y'all will have to maybe fill in the gaps on this, but I know we have some practices that are CIC practices within RCS. And what does CIC stand for again, Elise?
CIC is that NRCS plan that Darron was talking about, and it stands for Conservation Incentive Contracts. And it's a new, last year, 2022 was the first year that NRCS had these available. And it's specifically to implement climate smart ag and forestry practices. So it lined up perfectly with the beginning of the planning of your carbon farm plan.
Yeah. So we've been coordinating with our local agent on sort of the overlap of the practices that we were already planning on having in the carbon farm plan, and seeing how to sort of roll those into the NRCS practices as well. And within those contracts, you get a reimbursement for seed costs, or various kind of costs associated with implementing these practices. So it's kind of new territory for me. I haven't worked as closely with NRCS in the past, but it's cool that so much of what they're incentivizing also is wrapped up in these plans as well.
Well, I have really enjoyed working through this process with you, Matt, and I just, I think about it every time I work on it, and just picture it in my mind what beautiful agroforestry, food forest you're gonna have out there in outside of Austin, and I'm excited to see it and keep going.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, I'm excited about this season. I think hopefully we got our last little cold snap this past weekend, and should be going full speed into spring here this next week.
So yeah, I too am looking forward to, we've talked about it, kind of this utopian visual that we have for what the farm can become, supported by these beautiful wind barriers, and having these herbaceous wind barriers throughout along your contours, having these beautiful pollinator hedgerows and pollinator strips within your fields. I mean, it's such a dynamic ecosystem.
Jungle chickens.
Jungle chickens.
That's right.
Jungle chickens. Yeah, and mulching your orchard. I mean, there's so many stacked practices. Every practice that we've talked about today is an NRCS conservation practice. So these are all potentially, there are cost share rates. I'm not sure if in our state there are cost share rates for every single one of these practices, but like, for example, we were thinking about multi-story farming, which I think they're starting to call forest farming. And that doesn't necessarily have a practice code in the state of Texas. So we're kind of stacking things. We're saying tree shrub establishment, which is the orchard establishment, and then we'll have cover crop, which is going to be your annual under the trees. And then we're going to have mulching, which will be pruning some of the orchard and putting that around the bed of the trees. So most of this is potential to be reimbursable through NRCS equip.
Yeah.
So that's another funding opportunity that can be explored. And we're getting a lot of great technical assistance in partnership with NRCS. The district conservationists that we're working with in Travis County sent us a planting rate for that conservation cover, for example. And the co-benefit of that is really bringing in pollinators. That's what y'all identified as the purpose and function of those. And per their recommendations, they're saying 60% grasses, 40% forbs. So there's a lot of technical assistance that's kind of helping as we walk along with this, but it'll be a utopian landscape, and folks will have a chance to come see it on May 22nd.
Hope everyone can make it out to that. I think it's going to be a really interesting time to be out here. Things will be in full swing by then. Really excited to kind of see how some of these practices are shaping up by then.
Yeah, it's going to be great. So it's going to be from 9:30 in the morning to 2 in the afternoon. It'll be on New Leaf Farm, which again is about 30 minutes east of Austin. You can look, we'll put a registration link in the program notes, but you can also go to our ATRA website. I believe it's atra.ncat.org, and then click on events. And for May 22nd, it's a Carbon Farm Demo Day on New Leaf. We'll start off with a presentation by Carbon Cycle Institute. They'll be flying in from California to join us. And then we'll walk the farm, and Matt will have a chance to really show how he's thinking about all opportunities for carbon capture and what's been implemented thus far, what's on the near-term horizon, and then the long-term vision. So we look forward to having folks out with us. We'll have some lunch, nice conversation. Yeah. Okay. Well, Darron, thank you for all of your help with this too and guiding the conversation.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you. This has been fun.
It has been. It's been energizing. So thank y'all for your time. For those of you in our listening audience who are interested in more information about carbon farm planning, as previously mentioned, we will be having an event on May 22nd, but you can also email myself at eliseh@ncat.org or Darron Gaus at Darron, DARRONG @ncat.org. We'll also put that in the notes. And Matt, if you're okay with it, we'll share your information or the farm information with folks as well in the notes.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Website is mrcaustin.org. And we're currently promoting our spring and summer CSA as well. So if you're in the Austin area, we do have shares available for that still. So
I'm going to sign up.
You should.
I need to do that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.
That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. Additional information about this episode and related resources can be found at atra.ncat.org. Don't miss an episode. Subscribe to Voices from the Field wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Rich Myers. ATRA, Voices from the Field, is produced by the National Center for Appropriate Technology, headquartered in Butte, Montana. It's supported by the USDA Rural Business Cooperative Service as part of NCAT's ATRA Sustainable Agriculture Program. Any opinions, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this recording are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of the USDA or NCAT. We'll catch you again next week, and until then, keep on farming.